Hello everyone. In this video, we're going to introduce some of the basic core concepts that are going to carry through our conversations regarding adaptation and introduce major subjects that are going to govern the analysis of the various adapted works that we're studying in the course. In terms of today's lecture, we're going to be looking at five major points. First, we're going to be addressing the core concept that's really at the heart of everything we're going to discuss in this course, adaptation as a form of interpretation. We'll look at various forms of adaptations, the mediums and methodologies of adaptation. We'll look at different perspectives or the two predominant perspectives on adaptation. Adaptation as a kind of linear process that takes a source work and then translates it directly into an adaptation or another work that expresses fidelity towards its original source. And the other, a kind of multifaceted organic approach to adaptation that's more evolutionary in nature. And we'll get into what I mean by that when we begin to discuss it. We'll look at the purpose of adaptation, the objectives behind adaptation, and then we'll start to discuss, by way of some examples, the adaptation from text to audiovisual. The stories that we'll be looking at in this course, first, the novella or short story by H.P. Lovecraft, The Color of Space, and second, the play, The Tempest by Shakespeare, are both written literary texts. Many of the same concerns that govern their adaptation and their process of adaptation into an audiovisual medium of film are going to be the same. We'll discuss some of them in brief. There are other issues that are directly related to the nature of the form as a play, for instance, in Shakespeare's case, but we'll address those as we move forward in the course itself and begin to consider the work and the adaptations we'll be studying. First, the key concept that you should keep in mind, regardless of whatever it is that we're studying and whatever it is that we talk about in this course, is that every act of adaptation is an act of interpretation. In other words, every time that you take a story and begin to engage with it and to reformulate it into a different medium, every time you take a short story and make it into a movie, every time you take a graphic novel like Watchmen and turn it into the 2009 Watchmen film or the like, you're always engaged in an active interpretation. There's no way in which you can actually look at that text and then copy it directly without making some kind of set of value judgments on the work, its themes, and its ideas, and then importing those judgments, that interpretive lens that you bring to the text, into the work that you've produced as an adaptation. The adaptation, in the most simplistic view, might seem to be a direct copy of the original source. You are trying, as best as possible, to take the original source material and then translate it into another language, right? The language of, let's say, story to the language of film, with various different codes and conventions and tropes, expectations that define one or the other. However, we know that watching a film is never the same as reading the original work. There are always going to be distinctions to be drawn between the two, largely influenced by the way in which the original adapter, the director who has taken the story and then translated it into form, views that original work. The choice of things to be highlighted or dropped out, the way in which dialogue is altered, the way in which scenes are staged or set when you take the dialogue in the original story and then translate it into the actor's actual physical actions and responses. All of that is consciously considered. And in fact, it becomes a multifaceted interpretation in the sense that you have the director and the writer and all the actors and all the set designers, all these people coming together with their own individual visions for the story and their views on its ideas, its themes, and also the representation of its characters. And together, all those multifaceted views come together into the final adapted product if you're thinking about a film. Adaptation then instantiates a vision of the work and its values, perhaps multiple visions, as you have various different people working on the film adaptation, looking at the original work, forming their own opinions about it, their own ideas, and then taking those ideas and putting them to film. They're not taking, I should say, the story in itself and putting it to film. They're taking their subjective, personalized views of work. However much they might wish to maintain a kind of fidelity to the original work, they're still viewing it through their own eyes. They're still reading it through the lens of their own minds. And it's impossible to wholly divest oneself from that. In a way, the adapted work is kind of like an essay. In the same way that as you're writing an essay, you begin to engage with the story. You highlight certain details that are germane to your argument, that you think are most relevant, and you minimize or compartmentalize aspects of the story that are irrelevant to the particular point that you're trying to make. So too do filmmakers or any kind of adapter who is moving from one medium to another. or one genre to another, ultimately have to emphasize or de-emphasize certain aspects of the work in order to present the cohesive vision that they have, the cohesive argument that they have as to the story's original meaning. Now, arguably, this process can result in a reduction, a contraction of the possible meanings inherent in the work. That's not always true. It can, in fact, represent an expansion of the potentials and possibilities of the original work. But that question, or open question, of what is done to the meaning of the work and what the work is trying to say, is one that we'll be considering as we go on in the course. Now, there are as many kinds of interpretations or adaptations as there are kinds of stories. You can have a direct adaptation whose objective is ultimately to reframe the work in a new context. So you're trying to be as accurate as possible to what you believe the original work was. You can modernize the work. For instance, innumerable Shakespeare plays have been translated from the original context into a foreign one. The example of a trailer that's provided in this video, or the description box for this video, is the film O. The film O, which is about a basketball star who is betrayed into and sort of confused and twisted up in jealousy by the man who he believes to be his best friend into murdering the girl that he's in love with, is functionally an adaptation or a modernization of Shakespeare's play Othello, about a Venetian general in about 1550 who is married to a white woman, a black Moor who is married to this white woman. And he is, in the same way, driven to madness and murder by a man he trusts, his ensign, Iago. We'll take a look at some of the implications of these two kinds of adaptations as we go on, and as we look at different examples of them in the context of the various films that we watch. Some of the films we have are, for in the instance of The Color Out of Space, the first film is a direct adaptation. It takes the story pretty much as it was set and then attempts to be accurate. Right? The second version is a modernization, which takes the original work and then sets it into our contemporary period for a variety of reasons that we'll discuss when we get there. The next kind of adaptation is a bit of a loose sense of the use of the term. In this case of inspiration, the original work serves as the basis for many of the themes, ideas, and characters in this, well, adaptation, be it a film or a short story, but it's not a direct parallel. You don't have necessarily the same characters or the like. So as an example of that, you can look at the trailer that is included in the description of this video for The Call of Cthulhu, The Dark Corners of the Earth. The first author that we'll be studying in this class is H.P. Lovecraft, and we're going to be watching The Color Out of Space. Now, H.P. Lovecraft wrote innumerable short stories and novellas over the course of his career. One of them was The Shadow over Innsmouth. Now, the basic plot line of The Shadow over Innsmouth is that a protagonist enters into this dilapidated and backwater area of New England, and he finds that there's this race of basically fish people living off the coast that have begun to interbreed with the natives, and they're resulting in these hideous sort of miscaginated monstrosities. The trailer for the game that I've shown you takes that basic idea and then also aggregates a hodgepodge of different other plot points, ideas, and themes from Lovecraft's other works. So it's not that the story itself is a direct adaptation of The Shadow over Innsmouth, the short story that Lovecraft wrote. It's not the game as a direct adaptation of it, but it's inspired by it. It takes key figures, ideas, places, themes, and then merges them together with new ideas and also ideas drawn from other sources in order to create something that is, in a sense, an adaptation of that story, in that it is very closely parallel to it. It's a work that's been inspired by it. And we'll take a look at an example of this kind of film with respect to The Tempest in our story, or in the film that we'll watch at the end of the course, The Forbidden Planet, which takes Shakespeare's Tempest, a story of magic fundamentally, and transforms it into a work of science fiction. Other kinds or forms of adaptations would be serialized stories. Now, you haven't heard about the Shadow, probably, who is this pulp fiction character, but back in the 1920s and 30s, the Shadow was one of the most successful figures in popular culture. He had originally a series of stories that were written about him in pulp fiction magazines. So you could go to the store and buy almost like magazines of short stories that were produced monthly. And some of them featured this famous character, the Shadow, who grew to, as I said, tremendous popularity. But he was so successful that he spawned innumerable different adaptations. So suddenly you could go to the store and buy your collection of Shadow short stories. And then you also had the radio drama, the comic books, the television serial. So the story of the shadow became this multiform thing in which you had all these different media that were telling shadow stories that were all about the same character, all set in the same universe, but they had to be translated into different media. You had to find actors and directors. You also had to find story writers for both the actual written texts and the ones that were audio dramas. So, in a way, the story of the shadow and the character of the shadow is translated or adapted into all these serialized stories that are told month by month, week by week in all these various different media. You might think of the Marvel movies as something similar to that. The Marvel movies are serialized storytelling. You don't just watch one movie or one series of movies. Instead, you have this interconnected universe of 30 some odd movies, all of which bind together and tell one sort of developing, evolving storyline with side stories branching off here and there. That's fundamentally serialized storytelling. But the Marvel movies themselves are an adaptation. They're a reimagining of classical stories from Marvel Comics. So the Age of Ultron comics, they take that character of Ultron and then refigure him in a different way. Originally, he was created by Hank Pym in the comic books, but in the film, he's created by Iron Man because it fits better with the universe and the characters that they have access to at that point based on the story they've told. So that too is a process of adaptation. And if you want to think about adaptation in a contemporary context, you are quite familiar with it. Because whenever you sit down to watch Avengers Infinity War or Avengers Endgame or Captain Marvel, Thor or Iron Man, you're watching an adaptation. And the things that you take into consideration, even subconsciously when you're doing so, ultimately are many of the things that we'll be considering in this course. Now, I mentioned that there are two prevailing perspectives on adaptation. The first is simplistic replication, a linear and direct process of adaptation. In this classical view, adaptation really is just taking the story as accurately as possible, or the novel, or whatever your source material might be, their Iron Man comic book, and then translating it almost word for word, idea for idea, shot for shot, scene for scene, into a new form. All you're changing is the medium, right? The medium in which it's told, or through which it's told, rather than anything about the story itself. The objective of this kind of adaptation is, well, just direct copying. Now, in a classical sense, people oftentimes, this is arguable, but if we want to look at it in a reductive sense, oftentimes thought of adaptation as being nothing more than that. You are trying to replicate the original work as closely as possible. In a contemporary view, however, all adaptation becomes a kind of complex reimagining. The story is an interwoven tapestry when you adapt it, because in a film, for instance, or a television show, you have all these different competing voices of multiple writers, the studio that's trying to sell this film and their demands for what it has to be, the actors and their visions of characters and what they want. That's also something we'll be considering when we look at the Color Out of Space adaptations. Likewise, you have the perspectives of the various different special effects houses and the constraints of time and budget. So all these things come together to forge a product that is unique from its original source. Adaptation in this sense can be thought of something as akin to organic evolution and adaptation. In evolution, adaptation is the process by which animals become more fit to their environment, depending on those random genetic mutations. So, if you have a creature that becomes adapted to its environment over successive generations of evolutionary in an evolutionary timescale influence the way in which this creature will express its traits or the kinds of traits that it possesses. In the same way, an adaptation in this organic sense is a reflection of the particular socio-cultural and political period in which the film is produced, or in which that translation or adaptation is made. That work becomes a reflection of the time period, the prevailing perspectives, and the ideas in that age. The work is translated not just in terms of the story, as in a modernization, but also in terms of the ideas that it presents and how it frames the core ideas and themes of that original work to best address the demands of the moment. Also, things can be changed to render it more palatable, let's say, to a contemporary audience. This version, and we'll get into the specific details and examples of the things as we go into this course, but this kind of adaptation, or this vision of adaptation, recognizes that the adaptation itself is in fact involved not in this linear process of evolution, but in a complex conversation with the original work. It's commenting on the original work, it's engaging with the ideas of the original work, it's actively choosing or its creators are actively choosing to emphasize or de-emphasize certain aspects of the original work. It's embracing or rejecting ideas and aspects of the original. As we look at various different films in this course, we're going to look at the way in which some of these films do exactly that. The last point to keep in mind then is that it is fundamentally impossible to disconnect the work from its source. Every act of adaptation is contextualized by the very lenses of prior works. So in other words, you can never watch, let's say, a film without being reminded of the original story. Instinctively, even if you try to suppress that inclination, you are going to think back to the original work or other things that you've heard about the story or other adaptations that you've seen. For instance, there's going to be released on Amazon a Lord of the Rings series. I am never going to be able to watch that series and enjoy it in the way that I might be able to if I hadn't already seen the Lord of the Rings movies. I adored those movies. I saw the first Lord of the Rings film before I had ever read the novels, and that inspired me to read the novels. So, in a way, whenever you read or see one version of the story, whether it's the original or the adaptation, your vision of successive adaptations or successive entries in that series are always going to be colored by your preconceived notions of the other work. So, what we're thinking about here is a series of critical lenses, a series of, let's say, glasses that focus or bring into focus certain aspects of the work that you might not otherwise see or that might not otherwise rankle you. For me, I read the Lord of the Rings novels because I saw them, or I read them after I saw the films, through the lens of the movies. I saw the characters as, well, Ian McKellen as Gandalf, and Orlando Bloom as Legolas, and John Rhys-Davies as Gimli, Elijah Woods as Frodo. I couldn't help but see the characters as I read the novels with those faces because I already had this perceptual and conceptual lens of the, to me, original work, the film. Then, because I had seen or I had read through the entire series before the second Lord of the Rings film came out, I suddenly couldn't appreciate the second and third movies in the same way that I did the first because I was comparing them to the original work for me, which was the second and third novel set. So we always bring to the work of adaptation a kind of background set of beliefs, understandings, and perceptions based on the material to which we've been exposed already. Now, I have an example of some of these things drawn from my favorite, well, fictional franchise. The thing that I suppose, out of fiction, I love more than anything else. And that is Star Trek. Not this Star Trek, and not even this Star Trek, actually this Star Trek, but we'll talk about that in a minute. With Star Trek, because it's a franchise that's been around for nearly 60 years, and it's gone through innumerable different iterations or adaptations, from Star Trek the original series, to Star Trek the film series, to Star Trek the Next Generation, Star Trek Deep Space Nine, Star Trek the animated series, Star Trek Voyager, Star Trek Enterprise, Star Trek Discovery, Star Trek the 2009 films, Star Trek Lower Decks, and innumerably more. Because it's been in all these different forms, in all these different adaptations, Star Trek serves as an excellent example or case study in the process of adaptation and some of the things that we have to consider, or some of the ways in which adaptation can fundamentally transform a work. What we have here is a depiction of the cast from the original Star Trek, and then a depiction of the cast from the 2009 Star Trek reboot. And it illustrates the way in which the objectives of the filmmakers or of the showrunners can fundamentally transform a series to make it almost unrecognizable. Yes, you have the same places, you have the same names, you have many of the same visual nods. The uniforms here aren't entirely different. They're clearly inspired by the original. The characters, bear some superficial resemblance. I particularly like Bones, played by DeForest Kelley and Carl Urban. Great casting choice there. So you have these points of connection. The visual signs and symbols seem to correlate in our minds. So we see Star Trek when we see this image, in the sense that the costumes and the sets seem just about right. Maybe a little bit skewed, but close enough. However, the objectives behind these series were radically different. In the original, Gene Roddenberry wanted to explore essentially social and moral issues through the lens of well, science fiction. He wanted to essentially decontextualize issues of race and class, and warfare and struggle, and then present an idealistic, optimistic vision of the future, wherein all the various different species and races and nationalities, Scottish, Russian, American, Black, White, Vulcan, Japanese, all of them could come together in a spirit of shared values, a desire to expand the boundaries of human knowledge through cooperation and cultural interchange, and to better ourselves through that vision. This was the future that Gene Roddenberry said was possible for us. It might be a dream, this far off thing that we could gesture towards, that we grapple with, that we struggle to achieve. But maybe one day we can, as Captain Kirk himself says in the series at one point, maybe we weren't meant for paradise, but perhaps we can scratch and claw and struggle our way there. That is, and the exploration of the human condition is at the heart of Star Trek. It's not about the spaceships and phasers. All these things are window dressings, trappings, and means by which the fundamental contemplation of social, moral, and human issues can be affected. That's what Star Trek is all about. The 2009 J.J. Abrams reboot of Star Trek said, screw that, we want to make money, so let's put a lot of flashy lights on screen and we'll throw in some explosions and let's make a couple $1 billion with this franchise. That's at the core of the new Star Trek. Characters are radically transformed in order to appeal to the target audience that they are now trying to address. Whereas Kirk was, in a sense, the captain of the series, was a bit of a rogue. He was a bit of a maverick. He was an independent free thinker. He was also highly committed to Starfleet and to his duty. He recognized that he had this greater calling and this greater responsibility, not to himself, but to the people under his command. And that burden wore heavily on him at times. The new Captain Kirk is basically this juvenile rogue. He is rebellious. He disregards all authority for its own sake. He's been taken from the character that he was, this complex and multifaceted character, and reduced down to a set of different stereotypes and this almost parodic vision and that highlights certain aspects of the character to the exclusion of all the others. Why do they do that? Because it lends itself to comedy. It lends itself to these moments of almost quasi-juvenile rebellion and disrespect for authority that might be appealing to the target audience of this new series. Spock in the original series only expressed emotion on 2 occasions. 3. Those 3 occasions really were: 1, he was under the influence of this kind of space spore, so he was infected by a disease that caused him to lose control over his emotions. Spock is this alien, if you don't know about Vulcans, who is driven entirely, supposedly, by logic, and the species has learned how to suppress every single emotional response. In those 3 moments, like I said, one of them was where he did display emotion. One of those was when he was infected by that disease. The second one was when this biological urge for him to mate, as Vulcans do every 7 years, they have this pon farr that forces them into a mating cycle, came to the forefront. And the third time was when Captain Kirk, his best friend, fundamentally his brother, because these 3 characters, Dr. McCoy, Bones, Captain Kirk, and Spock, were the triad of this show. They were the emotional and logical core, the 3 brothers, 3 perspectives on the universe that were put into conversation in every episode, pretty much. You had the heart, the mind, and then almost like the spirit that conjoins the 2 and finds the way to mediate between the 2 in Captain Kirk himself. That third moment that Spock expressed emotion was when he learned, after believing that Captain Kirk was dead, exploded in joy just for a single moment when he saw that he was still alive before he regained that emotional control. In the new J.J. Abrams Star Trek reboot films, you have Spock, who supposedly suppresses his emotions, surrendering to them at all times. It suddenly becomes the norm for him to act out emotionally. Why do they do that? Well, because it makes for fundamentally a sexier film. It makes for a character that I can get into a little bit more because he's not this cold, reserved, stoic figure. And I don't have to watch, or I don't have time to watch 90 episodes of a television series in order to see those 3 moments where his emotions come to the forefront. I need that payoff, that revelation, because everything has to be condensed down into this, 2-hour movie. I need that emotional payoff because maybe I'm not going to get a sequel, so I have to do this at some point in the film. So we see Spock in the adapted films, in order to become a more relatable character, releasing those emotions all the time. But the process of adaptation, based on the target audience and the objectives of your work, whether it's philosophical contemplation of the human condition or pretty lights and lens flare, aren't the only things that influence the adaptation. In the original Star Trek, all of the principal characters were male. You had the con officer, or the comms officer, Uhura, who was a main character, in as much as somebody like Sulu or Chekhov were. And you had Nurse Chapel, who was a competent medical practitioner and featured quite frequently. But they were consigned to roles that were perhaps a little bit more stereotypically acceptable for women. Star Trek The Next Generation. Star Trek The Next Generation is, in a sense, an adaptation of the original. It takes a different context. It's set 100 years after the original series, and it has an entirely new cast of characters and a new ship, still called the Enterprise. The original Enterprise was just the Enterprise. This is the fifth ship in its lineage, the Enterprise D in Star Trek Next Generation. It carries through with many of the same ideas about the objective of the series being the exploration of the human condition. And it still has this diverse cast of men and women, aliens, people from different species, somebody who's not human, an android whose very purpose is to become more human. That's what he desires more than anything else, Commander Data here. But it also expanded the possibilities. The chief medical officer here, reflecting the zeitgeist of the era, was Dr. Crusher, a woman. The chief security officer in the first season of Star Trek The Next Generation was also a woman. So there was this conscious attempt to take the ideals of Star Trek and actually push them forward into the contemporary age by building on that groundwork, which was revolutionary and progressive for the age, and to take that into a contemporary context without being divisive, without being aggressive about its politics, but recognizing how these values could be played out in the new social context of our own period. And so the show reflects, well, the spirit of our age, while still being true to the core themes and fundamental value system of the original work. Another kind of adaptation where they took the original crew of the Enterprise and brought them into the movies. Here, the costumes changed. Why? Well, because, much as I love Star Trek, in the original series, these costumes look a bit like pajamas, right? So for a film-going audience, they expected a higher caliber of special effects. And the tone of those films was more militaristic. It shifted from that optimistic setting of exploration to a more military-focused organization, Starfleet. So based on the new budget that they had, the expanded budget, based on the fact that they knew that audiences going to a theater would be expecting higher quality special effects, higher budget costumes, and because they wanted to change the tone, you can't tell this sort of exploratory story in the context of a film. In fact, comparing the first Star Trek film to the second Star Trek film and how those two adaptations radically diverge from each other, as the first one tries to capture the spirit of the original series, and the second one, Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan, depicted here, goes in a completely different direction. That in itself would make for basically half of a course, just thinking about how those two works reflect and try to adapt the principles and characters and settings and schemes of the series in fundamentally and radically different ways. But based on what the audience is looking for, based on the new tone that they're looking for that is militaristic rather than exploratory, the film becomes something fundamentally different. Now, it still has that exploration of the human condition, and The Wrath of Khan remains one of the greatest movies that has ever been made. And if you haven't seen it, you probably should, because it's a complex commentary on not just Star Trek, but also on things like King Lear and Moby Dick and Tale of Two Cities, as it interweaves those intertexts throughout its narrative. So it's a very clever, intelligent film. Other adaptations or works that have been inspired by Star Trek, two different cartoon adaptations or animated adaptations. Other examples of how adaptation fundamentally transforms a work. With Star Trek the Animated Series, that took all the actors from the original series and brought them in as voice actors for this 1960s, 1970s cartoon show. They tried to directly continue the character, the nature, and the storytelling of that first series, while also changing it in order to make it more palatable for children. They recognized that a cartoon would appeal to children, and so they changed some of the interactions. They included things like, let's say, Spock's pet Salot, which is like a saber-toothed bear that he had as a child. So there are these moments or these visual cues inside the series that make it more palatable, make it more interesting as an adaptation for young children, will still maintain that same spirit of discovery, telling the same kinds of stories that they could in the original series. But they did so in a more grandiose fashion, because suddenly you weren't limited to, well, little fake prosthetic ears. Suddenly you could have fantastical aliens depicted without any concern for practical effects, makeup, or budget. I could have M. Rest, the cat person, on my bridge. I could have this Ethosian on my bridge with 3 legs and 3 arms and a completely alien physique, because now, well, I don't have any concern about prosthetics, props, or budget. Likewise, the kinds of things that the Starship Enterprise encountered in this series were actually those that the series creator always wanted them to encounter. They could depict fantastical, unearthly landscapes. In the show, they often landed on planets that looked exactly like Earth because, well, budget is limited. So you have to make use of the sets and props that you have, and also locales you have. In this series, they landed on planets with flora and fauna that were completely alien to anything that you would see on Earth, because they could do that. And in a way, this Star Trek cartoon thus reflected the vision as an adaptation of the authors and the creators' original desires for the series better than did the television show, the live action show. Then you have the most recent iteration of Star Trek. So different that it's barely even recognizable as Star Trek Lower Decks. And if you haven't seen that, don't, because just don't. Go invest your time in watching Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan. With Star Trek Lower Decks, you have a series that's essentially an irreverent meta-parody of the original, well, values and concepts of the series. But you see again how social, political, and economic factors can influence the creation of a series. Well, Star Trek, the original animated series, was fundamentally all about capturing the tone and unlocking the potential of the original work in ways that couldn't be done in live action. Star Trek Lower Decks is less a response to Star Trek than it is to Rick and Morty. And if you're familiar with the cartoon show, you know that there's this grim, irreverent, visceral tone to the series. And while Star Trek Lower Decks isn't as nihilistic as Rick and Morty by any means, it's still an attempt to capture the same kind of humor that has proven so successful and financially viable in Rick and Morty. The animation style, the approach of characters, the principal character being this drunken, hyper-competent individual who has basically a Morty character following her around. It's all designed to emulate something that has been successful commercially. So Star Trek in this adaptation isn't really Star Trek at all. It's a mass-produced series that is designed to play off of contemporary entertainment or things that are successful in contemporary entertainment by incorporating the tropes and elements of those series into itself and slapping on or slathering on a veneer of Star Trek in order to attempt to attract the audience, the old audience that was interested in the original series and in all the other adaptations and iterations of Star Trek from that point. So, in terms of tone, its frenetic, frantic pace, in terms of its animation style, in terms of its comedy, it's all designed based on almost like a cookie cutter cardboard cutout vision of what the studio executives believe can be successful based on contemporary trends in animation. So you see this complex way in which all these different social and political forces can influence how series are created or how adaptation is done. The purpose of adaptation. The purpose of adaptation is in fact an open question. Why do we adapt stories? Some of the possibilities are it's to reframe it for a new audience. Fundamentally, Star Trek the Animated Series was designed for children. It was also designed to capture the vision of the creators of the series, but there were certain aspects of the show that were designed to appeal to a younger audience. Star Trek Lower Decks is not designed for Star Trek fans. Right? Most Star Trek fans seem to quite dislike it, or at best tolerate it because, well, with recent Star Trek, this is actually the best that we've gotten, which is sad, but that's because Star Trek is dead now. Regardless, it's also designed to appeal to fans of Rick and Morty. The point is that this series is developed with a completely different audience than was, let's say, Star Trek The Next Generation or the Star Trek film series. And we saw how the change from the original Star Trek to this Star Trek is based on the audience to which you're trying to appeal. You can also try to render palatable something that is impalatable or relevant. So for instance, when we look at H.P. Lovecraft's adaptations, we're going to see that there are moments in H.P. Lovecraft's original works where his strident xenophobia and racism comes to the forefront. Many adaptations of Lovecraft will try to downplay or in fact counter that xenophobic perspective inherent in his works. So they're shaping the works or reshaping the original story in the adaptation in order to account for contemporary sensibilities. Or maybe you want to create an exact replication. Your objective is really to be as close as possible to the original work. The last thing we're going to take a look at is this idea of translation from text to audiovisual form, and some of the concerns that are going to govern our discussions from this point forward. When you're looking at the adaptation from a story to a film or a television series, things to look for: what has been added? Why are there additional scenes? And what is the purpose of these additional scenes? Likewise, are there additional characters? Why have those characters been added in? How do they change the story's ideas and its presentation of these ideas? How have the themes been changed based on addition or excision? Things have been added and things have been taken away very consciously. You can't just go to the work and then start ripping out pages and saying, I don't need this. The director or the writer, if he actually cares about what he's doing, is going to very carefully look at the original work and tailor it, modify it, and remove things that don't fit with his vision of what he wants to create or the story that he wants to tell or how he reads the story. And he will add in things at times to make it fit with that vision. And we'll look at some of the examples of that as we go on. And then you have another consideration. You're moving from language to moving pictures. Our imagination is always going to be more powerful than the image that we see. On the one hand, a picture might be worth 1,000 words. So a film might be worth 10 million because you have innumerable different individual still frames of moving pictures. However, the power of our imagination to conjure things that are beyond reality and beyond anything that can be instantiated in film cannot be discounted. And it's something that we'll consider as we think about how language can shape emotion and a perspective in the mind that is so much more visceral and also so much more ephemeral. It's something we can't grasp as we look at these films. In the case of Lovecraft, the color out of space is explicitly described in terms that don't allow it to cohere, don't allow it to coalesce. The color out of space, this monster in the story, isn't something we can picture because it's literally physically impossible, and that's the point. So the moment that you try to render it into reality, into a visual medium of film, suddenly you've lost the entire point of the original work. In the translation or the adaptation from story to film, you're looking at moving language and the descriptions you have into actual visual representations. And that's something that we're going to consider. I'm not going to get into detail about the implications of this or the things we have to consider as we think about it, but that's something to keep in the back of your mind as you're reading through these stories and thinking about how these stories would be or could be adapted into visual media and how they are when we actually look at the film adaptations themselves.